Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was December 27th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Juan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. I gotta tell you, as I was looking through the registers of the letters of Juan and Violant for the beginning of 1387, I didn't expect to luck out in the way that I did. And what I mean is that right away on December 26th and December 27th, I found a pairing of letters from Juan and Violant on the same subject. And maybe it wasn't luck at all. Maybe they're just constantly doing this. What am I talking about? I'm talking about how they would work in tandem on particular issues. Juan would send a letter, and then Violant would send a letter to the same recipient on the same subject. Maybe this was standard practice? Maybe other couples did this? Elite couples in royal families? I don't know, but I will say that I looked very, very closely at an instance of this later on in their reign. An episode that took place in 1393, and it was just very interesting to me in that case how Juan and Violant were working together, advocating on a particular issue. So today's document, what we're going to see is that Violant is writing a letter to Juan Fernández Heredia, the master of Rhodes, the same person who was the recipient of the letter we were focusing on yesterday. And the language of this letter is nearly identical to what Juan had written. So a day passes, and we have this letter from Violant also advocating for Bernardo Maloll to get the new job in some monastery somewhere. And the descriptors that Violant assigns to Maloll are pretty much the same. It's not like a word-for-word copy. There's kind of different choices made about how to exactly phrase it, but the meaning is really identical, and also the length of the letter is almost identical to the one that Juan had written the day before. So why aren't they done at the same time? Why is one dated a day before the other? Is this an intentional thing so that Juan's letter arrives first, and that, there's a statement here about sort of the proper order in which the letters should be written, the person with more power, the Duke, versus the person with presumably lesser power, the Duchess? It's possible. I do not know enough to answer that question. So this really gets into some other questions that you might have about the routine of the royal chancery. What was going on that produced the documents that we have to look at today? You gathered from my explanation yesterday that this is not in the handwriting. What we're looking at is not in the handwriting of the sender for the most part. I mean, I think I could probably safely say that 99% of the outgoing letters that we're looking at in the archive of the Crown of Aragon for this time and place, this general time and place, they're copies. They're copies of outgoing letters. And I would say that really you can count on the idea that the scribes were writing down the originals of the outgoing letters also as the person was dictating to them what should be said. And furthermore, I would say that it is definitely possible. I think that you really have to get into a close reading to know this next thing with any kind of definitive measure. But it's possible that the person who's responsible for the letter, the powerful person, the duke, the duchess, the king, the queen, they're telling the scribe the topic of the letter and what they want communicated. And the scribe is basically composing the whole thing, bringing it to that authority figure and saying, is this good? And the authority figure says, yep, that's good. And then they send it out. Then, whether the letter is an original composition in the person's hand, like in Juan's own handwriting, or Violant's own handwriting, or whether it's something that was originally handwritten by the scribe, it then goes to the staff of the chancery, where it gets copied into the sheaf of papers, probably unbound initially, although not sure about that. And after it gets copied down, then it gets folded up and maybe there's like a seal applied to it, and then it's sent off. So what we're looking at are those copies of the outgoing letters. And that's why we've got that probata documentation at the end. Because that particular scribe, that staff member of the Royal Chancery, is saying, on my honor, these are the words that were in this letter. And they're basically putting their own name to that. Essentially, it's like a legal testimony that what they have copied is true, word for word, as to what was sent out. I mean, you can just imagine the kinds of disasters that could happen if there's sloppiness happening, so that the meaning of what you think you sent that's in the copy, you consult it later, and then what actually got sent out is different. I mean, it could cause a really big problem. So, there was some pressure on these scribes to get it right. And at the same time, you can really tell that occasionally they were working at a really furious pace. The timing of all this is pretty interesting because it's super clear that there were backlogs. So in the registers, there's time jumps. Like sometimes you'll be reading a letter from one day, and then the next letter is from the next day, and it's all very orderly. And then suddenly there's something from a month prior thrown in there. and then it goes back to the and so you're kind of left wondering, like, oh my gosh, did like this one get forgotten somewhere? Like, what is the explanation for this? And then other times it's just like clear that there were a whole stack of letters from around like a 2 week period, and the dates are all like jumbled. And so it's going back and then forward and then back and then forward, 2 days, 3 days. And so you can tell that there was a bit of a backlog in the chancery at that time. So it's, I think, pretty interesting to notice those kinds of things. While we're on the topic of the material object of the register itself, I want to point out that I want to address something that you've probably noticed. There's holes. There's holes in these papers. Those kind of globs that you see that are just kind of looking like damage to the paper, those are wormholes. Those are good old bookworms. Some of them might be kind of insects, but I from what I've heard, those are like literally worms that are like burrowing through these things as they were in storage and left alone for at times, a couple centuries. So some of the documents have just a ton of damage, and others are relatively minor. What you're looking at in today's document, I would call, relatively speaking, minor damage. So there's a bunch of holes, but overall it's pretty minor damage. Okay, one other thing that I wanted to mention about the format of the letter here is that there's some things that are consistent and other things that are not consistent as you look from letter to letter in these registers. Here's what's consistent. The name of the recipient appears at the beginning of the letter, not always right away, as in the case in this particular letter. Sometimes it's within the first couple lines because the sender could appear at the very beginning of the letter. You'll find it, though, you'll find the recipient's name absolutely within the first couple lines of the letter. Sometimes you luck out and the recipient is at the very beginning, like in this case. Okay. In this situation, we see maestro amigo, master friend. And we know that it's, again, Heredia, the master of Rhodes, because in the last line, the little short line, the bottom left corner, we see, in this situation, it's Rhodes. It's not Rodi, like we had in Juan's letter. Here it's Rhodes with an S. This is, I think, scribal preference in how to refer to Rhodes, which is interesting. That gets into something that's not consistent. But let me just talk about two other things that are consistent. The probata, the notation about the scribe saying, I here testify that this is a true copy of what got sent out, that is always at the lower right, below the document. One other thing that's consistent in all the documents is that on the last line of the block of the document's text is the date. Okay? And what's kind of fun about this document that we're looking at today is that you can clearly see that on the last line of the text block there, the letters S, E, T. That is set. It's 7. And so what we have here is the date of a 7, but it looks like they're missing the 80. Oh, no, they've got it in there. Sorry. So it's 1387. Okay. And we'll talk about, at the beginning of the line, you can clearly see December there with a macron. at the end. Okay, so the date is reliably at the end of the document. What's not consistent? Name spellings, as we've seen. And then also where the sender is located. So in this situation, we see La Duquesa de Girona at the bottom left, like right above where Master of Rhodes is written there. And so, in yesterday's document, we had Primogenite at the top. So that can kind of float around. Okay, so there's a couple other things I could talk about, consistency or not consistency, but oh my gosh, we're already really at like 15 minutes here. So I just want to mention something about the content of the document, that what we're looking at here is an example of influence, that the secular authorities are influencing or attempting to influence ecclesiastical appointments in the Crown of Aragon. That's really what this document is doing. So questions that come up, goodness, I've already mentioned a few. We can really repeat a lot of the questions that I thought of yesterday with the letter from Juan. I think my major question here is, how is this letter an example or an illustration of the way that the two of them were working in tandem? And how unusual was that compared to other elite couples? I'm also really wondering still about whether this was a composition from Violant herself, or whether the scribe basically composed it because she told him to, and she just kind of signed off on it. That's really the major mystery that I would love to know about this. Last but not least, I want to know the gender dynamics that we see in this letter. What is it an illustrative example of in terms of Violant's authority as a duchess? Also, the way that she has more clout in particular situations because of her connections to French nobility and French royalty. I really want to know about how this is kind of like a situation where she might have more power overall than Joan because she has more connections in France, and this Pope is French. So that's really one of the largest questions that I have, one of the most burning questions, because in this podcast, one of the main goals is for me to figure out some information about what was going on in terms of gender between Joan and Violant, and how they related to the outside world and how it affected their political authority. All right, that does it for today. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website, jonathanseyfried.net, to see an image of today's document with those wormholes and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Juan of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.